Okay, now if you have seen my videos before, you know that I'm not given to being hyperbolic. I want to be credible. I show you the sources that I'm talking about and that sort of thing. But it appears that we may have, and I say may have, we may have entered a new nuclear arms race. Just depends on what happens from here. So this meme that you see on the screen is actually really instructive of saying, hey, we're either joining NATO or we have to nuclear rearm. Now, I know some people will think, well, you don't have time to nuclear rearm or whatever. There's actually a third path, and that is that Ukraine is destroyed. And if Ukraine's destroyed, it becomes a third path where many nations around the world get the lesson that without that nuclear weapon, if they can't join NATO, or NATO won't defend them or whatever, that the third path is that other countries in the world will do everything humanly possible to get nuclear armaments. Now, let me lay out my case and talk about what I see here. So, St. Javelin put this out and said, what do you think about the idea of Ukraine having its own nukes? Now, it's talking to a pro-Ukraine audience mostly, and pretty much everyone was saying, yes, this is a good idea. They need to do this, whatever. Jonathan Fink, Silicon Curtain, said, only this will wake the US and Europe out of their catatonic slumber. The foreign policy suicide in the face of revanchist authoritarians we have seen in recent decades. And like, that's right. If they keep coming, like this choice here is actually what's necessary. Like Zelensky's putting it out there. He's making it clear. So let's look at this first before we talk about Zelensky. Ukraine gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal after signing the 1991 Non-Proliferation Treaty and the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. A preserved command post and missile silo now serve as a museum exhibit showcasing past power. And so this is just, you can watch a little clip of this. This is what the silo looked like. And you'll see in 1991, Ukraine inherited the third most powerful nuclear arsenal. So it would have been the United States and Russia and Ukraine, I think in that order. And that was something just, but it's pretty amazing to think that Ukraine had this. Now, they didn't, it was controlled from Moscow, but it was located physically on Ukrainian land. And the United States wanted to not have, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, multiple states with nuclear weapons. And so they kind of strong-armed them into pushing all those nuclear weapons into Russia, and Ukraine giving it up. The Budapest Memorandum was signed saying, look, we're going to set this, we're going to give you these assurances. Now, assurance in, I was just reading this in, I'm trying to remember what the name of the book is. I have to look it up. I was just reading this, that assurances meant guarantees. I mean, that's essentially the same word translated in Putin's World by Angela Stent. That's the book that I was reading, Putin's World. And so we translate it as assurances, which is looser than guarantees, but in both Ukrainian and Russian, it meant guarantees. So Ukraine felt fairly safe. Russia was guaranteeing it, United States and UK was guaranteeing it. And apparently those guarantees fell quite short. Okay, at any rate, a little bit more from the video here. But the sacrifice for the sake of international peace. Now, this is the 1991 agreement. This is before the Budapest Memorandum. And then it was President Bill Clinton who was pushing on the Budapest Memorandum in order to get those assurances. Okay, and so this is what it looks like. You'll get to see a little bit of what it looks like inside and what the launch looks like. Looks like a Commodore 64 kind of computer. And there's a launch, and they're testing it and seeing that this works. This is the inside. It's now a museum, right? Okay, so that's what's happened here. Now, let's go to today. In rightly pointing out that Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for a paper one that no one honored, Zelensky tells NATO members that Ukraine must either return to being a nuclear country or becoming a full member of NATO. That's logical. That brings us right back to where we are with this path. But he's not saying that because he wants to go nuclear. He's saying we chose NATO. We want to go this direction. But NATO's like, I'm not so sure. We really want to embrace that. And there's a reason why. And you'll see when we get to the Bob Woodward video in just a little bit why. Okay, Anton Gerashenko, President Zelensky, Ukraine chooses NATO, not nuclear weapons. I mean, he couldn't be clearer here. Ukraine chooses NATO, the NATO direction. This is common and long-suffered choice of the Ukrainian people. It is a consequence of Russia's war against Ukraine, especially its full-scale part. NATO is a priority. Does anything depend on Ukraine at this stage? Actually, no. Ukraine already did all she could. Now this is a question of political decision by all our partners and allies. And it really is. It really comes down to them. But here's Vlad Vexler. Zelensky's victory plan is an appeal to a world that isn't there. It demands that the West acts as it might have were it not mired in democratic decline, global retreat, and strategic doldrums. The West is not hesitant about Ukrainian victory. It doesn't want it. It's only committed to Ukrainian survival. Fundamentally, changing this requires strategic vision. And strategic vision requires our democracies to be in a better place than they are right now. The West acts as if Zelensky isn't conveying a dire message. Without increased support, Ukraine may lose the war. Meanwhile, Zelensky sidesteps Western pressures for substantial compromise, like succeeding Ukrainian territory to Russia and not reclaim it by force. So that's where we are. The West, there's a failure of political will here. Okay. Full circle. Gary Kasparov talks about this. Well, he's answering someone. So the first person says, Zelensky finally says out loud the thing that has been increasingly obvious. Either Ukraine gets full NATO membership or we'll have to pursue nuclear rearmament. Or the third option is being destroyed. And that third option leads to something even worse, and we'll talk about that at the end. Full circle. The US and UK and Russia promise Ukraine security in exchange for giving up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. As I wrote in 2014, if only nukes equal protection because the US can't be trusted, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Saudi, and others will move too. Did you hear that? That's the world that we're moving toward. Okay. Here's another one. Ukraine had 10 missile divisions with intercontinental nuclear missiles with a flight range of 11,000 kilometers, a stockpile of nuclear weapons that could destroy the planet several times. Ukraine had 1,272 atomic bombs in their intercontinental missiles. As for tactical nuclear weapons, no one knows how many there were. Vladimir Solenko, who was in charge of the special service of the 46th Missile Division in Peremysk, Mykolaiv Oblast, explained what power did Ukraine have before signing the Budapest Memorandum. And you see in this video, he's like pointing out on the map, like, hey, we had it here, we had it there, we had it here, we had it this other place. Like, they had lots of nuclear weapons. Okay. Meanwhile, Russian propagandist Solyov says tactical nuclear weapons should be used because Russia has invested an insane amount of money in them. Hey, what good's having this if we're not going to use it after all? Great. And Dmitry Medvedev is weighing in, given the seemingly meaningless chatter around the creation of nuclear weapons by the Banderite Ukraine, we can only draw one sad conclusion. The Nazi regime is trying to create a dirty bomb. Medvedev wrote. Well, they might actually be, well, they're not a Nazi regime, but they might actually be trying to create some kind of equivalent so that Russia has to back up and not decide that they're going to use that. According to him, Ukraine has all the capabilities for this: raw materials, technology, specialists, and any Soviet-era laboratory will do for making a low-power charge, he says. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, or how hard or difficult this is, but, they have to be thinking in defensive terms. I'm sure the United States would not want them to be doing that, but, they're at that crossroads. Okay, so I was listening to Bob Woodward as he's talking about his book, War. He's on his tour right now as it's coming out, and it's just the prime time for it to get out and get sales. So he's talking about this. And he just gave the Lloyd Austin talk, the bit about Lloyd Austin that I talked about this morning. Look, I don't make threats, Shoigu, right? Okay, so now he's going to talk about the calculus in the president's side. And let's hear what he has to say, because this is really instructive.
In behind the scenes, and you see this kind of real struggle to keep the world from spinning out of control, because should Putin order the use of tactical nuclear weapons, the world changes. In the Biden administration, they obviously don't want to have it happen on their watch, but they realize if it does happen, they define an era. And for 80 years, no nuclear weapons have been used. And here's Putin, Putin, who is not only sadistic but uh, totally in charge, threatens this. And so they examine, quite rightly, the conditions. Now, wait a minute, why would he use tactical nuclear weapons? And they get into, there are many explicit scenes about the worry in Russia. They have a doctrine that they can use tactical nuclear weapons if they face or experience what they call catastrophic battlefield loss. In other words, there are scenes in Ukraine where the Russians are really threatened with catastrophic battlefield loss, and under their doctrine, use tactical nuclear weapons. And this,
Okay, and this is what the Biden administration's great fear is that this is going to prompt them to use nuclear weapons. Now, this is why they're not even allowed to use long-range U.S. Missiles, because the U.S. doesn't want them to get to a place where the Russians feel this catastrophic loss, which means that the Ukrainians are going to be locked into this place where they simply can't win. I think that's what's going on. I could be wrong, but this is my read of it, and that he's just articulated that. Now, on the other side of that, I thought it was interesting to juxtapose these two as well, because we're talking about the Russian mentality, and we're talking about, well, President Nixon's prediction. Now, what's curious about this is that it was Woodward and Bernstein that brought down Nixon, but Nixon, before he passed, said this.
True. It is often said that the Cold War is over and that the West has won it. That's only half true, because what has happened is that the communists have been defeated, but the ideas of freedom now are on trial. If they don't work, there will be a reversion to not communism, which has failed, but what I call a new despotism, which would pose a mortal danger to the rest of the world.
And that's where we are. We're in a new despotism where we see authoritarian regimes kind of band together in order to overthrow the international order.
Would be infected with the virus of Russian imperialism, which of course has been a characteristic of Russian foreign policy for centuries. The West has, the United States has, all those who want peace and freedom in the world, a great stake in freedom succeeding in Russia. If it succeeds, it will be an example for others to follow. It will be for China, for example, to follow. If it fails, it means that the hardliners in China will get a new life. They will say, it failed there, there's no reason for us to turn to democracy. That's part of what is at stake here.
Okay, but it has failed in Russia, but it was kind of succeeding and growing and becoming more Eurocentric and more democratic in Ukraine. And that meant that Ukraine was parting from the Russian orbit. And I think that's part of what was going on with the original invasion itself. Okay, last little bit here. So make Ukraine nuclear again. I'm not sure that this one's going to get traction, but I think that's what may be a consequence of not bringing Ukraine into or closer to NATO or protecting it in a much more full-throated way. And then see this is a very common meme, but here Ukraine is looking at Ukrainian nuclear weapons as opposed to NATO promises. Ooh, this looks a lot more attractive, doesn't it, than what he's getting right now. And then finally, Darth Putin says your escalation management has led to Russian nuclear tech being given to Kim Jong-un in exchange for cannon fodder. Like, you're not de-escalating, you're actually escalating. And so that brings us back to the same path. And by the way, here, I've heard this on reports in DW and other places that this may be what's going on. We don't know for sure, but I'm giving you my source here. I was just watching this just a little while ago. Okay, so there's now 3 paths. One is join NATO, one is nuclear armament, and the third path is that Ukraine is destroyed. And I hope this doesn't happen. Ukraine's destroyed. And the lesson to the world will be, if you don't want to be destroyed by a nuclear armed power, you must have nuclear weapons yourself, because these promises are no good. Okay, my friends, that's all that I have right now. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.